Hi. Hi. You can see me? No.
I'm talking with Tonette Robinson.
Could you hold up 1 minute? Could you hold 1 minute? Kenya, come here. I need you to go in the room by Nigel.
Tonette
So
is
I
in
can
New
talk
Orleans,
to
where
Miss.
she
I need
lives.
to talk
And
to
right
Maya.
now,
Come here. Let me
she's
go out
wrangling
here
her
now.
two
Come on.
granddaughters,
Come
Kenya
on,
and
Michelle. We
Joy,
have to. We
getting
have
them
an
ready
important
to
meeting.
go to a doctor's
Here. Come on.
appointment.
Now, go ahead. Say hi. Hi. Wave. Say hi. Now go close the door for me. Okay. Okay. Go by Nigel.
Tonette has been raising them since her daughter died in 2020.
June 11, 2020, I get that horrible phone call that my daughter passed. I said, well, I know now why I didn't die for COVID. I had to be here to raise those girls.
Shaquita Robinson was only 30 when she went to sleep one night and never woke up. Her cause of death remains unclear. Was it an overdose? Was it suicide? Was it something else? Tonette Robinson may never know. But she does know that her daughter, who always struggled, began a downward spiral in 2005 from which she never would recover. Hurricane Katrina.
And with much of New Orleans now underwater, authorities are focused on search and rescue before it's too late.
The flood waters flooded out the whole New Orleans. They had water from the rooftops. A lot of people were dying. Bodies was floating on water. They had feces in the water. Even churches, buildings, the rooftops blowed off the building. But where I was living on the West Bank. And this is the oldest building. This building been through that Betsy, and all of a sudden, when that storm hit, windows went to cracking. The window around the whole building went to crumbling in. I said, oh my God.
Tonette worked in food service at a New Orleans hospital and was expected to be there during the hurricane. With nowhere else to go and nowhere to leave her 3 children, she brought them with her.
All the generators went out. Tornadoes was dropping and hitting in that parking lot, tearing up the building and breaking windows.
The hospital was evacuated after it and the neighborhood around it flooded.
I went home. I prayed that my house still would be standing.
It was, thank goodness. Tonette and the kids hunkered down there, one of just a handful of families left behind without power or fresh supplies until help came. This was hard on all of them. But Shaquita was hit hardest.
The mood swings and the behavior had really changed drastically. She went into a depression because at the time we ran out of food and it was taking a precious time to come in to help us. And it was like we was struggling trying to survive by eating whatever I had. And then when they did come out, it was like she was still like in her room, never wanted to come out. She was in her room depressed. All my kids, they was just trying to survive. But she was always a type child to stay alone. She was isolated from everybody.
It's been nearly 20 years since Katrina ravaged New Orleans, and since then, researchers have been trying to trace the mental health impact of disasters like this on children. With disasters like this increasing in frequency and intensity, we probably ought to be talking more about what they found. From Texas Public Radio, this is Petrie Dish. I'm Bonnie Petrie.
Support for Petrie Dish is made possible by UT Health San Antonio, committed to transforming the health of the community through a team that tackles problems from every angle, doing everything it takes to bring each patient the best possible outcomes. From teaching tomorrow's healthcare leaders to translating research into new treatments, UT Health San Antonio strives to make lives better. Learn more at everythingittakes.org.
August of 2017, Hurricane Harvey roared ashore in Texas as a Category 4 hurricane, but by the time it arrived in Houston, it had weakened to a tropical storm. It stalled there, and it was a rainmaker. Harvey dumped 4.5 feet of rain on southeast Texas in 4 days, leaving entire neighborhoods underwater, like New Orleans during Katrina. In those neighborhoods were homes to families with children whose worlds had just been turned upside down. Julie Kaplow is an expert on how kids handle this kind of trauma. She's a clinical psychologist and the executive vice president of trauma and grief programs and policy at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute in Texas. She also was in Houston for Harvey as a child psychologist and a researcher. She's used what she's learned to build programs to help kids who've been battered by this kind of trauma.
Really what we're trying to do is equip communities after these types of events to be able to support their youth, to support the caregivers, to know how to support the children, and certainly to support all of the adults who are likely to encounter these kids over time.
And Dr. Kaplow, it does seem like there is a greater need for this kind of support than ever before. We're talking about this because of the hurricanes, Helene and Milton, that were stark reminders that climate change is unforgiving. But it seems like kids now are just experiencing a lot more of this sort of earth-shattering type of trauma than kids in my generation did, including natural disasters. But we also have mass shootings, and it's all over the backdrop of a pandemic, things that people my age didn't have to deal with.
You're absolutely right, Bonnie, that these types of incidents are happening more and more frequently. And so we've actually intervened in the aftermath of many of those experiences. So, for example, after Hurricane Harvey in Houston, we launched the Hurricane Harvey Resiliency and Recovery Program, where we intervened with so many of the families that were negatively impacted, who had lost their homes, who had lost their pets, who had also lost loved ones. In the aftermath of the Santa Fe school shooting, we went in and helped to establish, in collaboration with others, the Santa Fe Resiliency Center, where we were helping so many of the children and families who were impacted by that mass shooting.
Some of our listeners might not know about Santa Fe. It's a small city, not even 13,000 people in southeast Texas, not too far from Houston. And in 2018, 10 people, students and teachers, were killed in a shooting at the high school.
Similarly, after the Uvalde shooting, we trained all of the Uvalde school district counselors and school-based clinicians in how to support kids who had experienced that event.
Uvalde is also in Texas, and what they're training people to watch for are signs of trauma and teach them how to intervene to minimize the impact of that trauma on a child's long-term mental health. Now, what they look for changes over time.
You know, in the more immediate aftermath of the disaster, the first step for us is really helping to identify where is the greatest need. For many children and families in that more immediate aftermath, it is simply about survival mode. You know, how do we get them housing? How do we help them find resources? Beyond that, though, from a psychological perspective, there is something called psychological first aid that is really helping people to cope in that more immediate aftermath. And again, it is about problem solving, getting the resources they need, helping them to feel more safe and secure.
Psychological first aid. Yes, we've talked about that here before on Petrie Dish, early in the pandemic when we were all still sort of trying to get our mental bearings. That's what PFA can do for families who are reeling from whatever disaster has happened. With PFA, you help them get stabilized, you connect them with resources, you help them figure out which way is up, basically. At this point, most children will be a little shaky.
You know, for most kids, certainly after a hurricane like that, it is absolutely normal and to be expected for children within the first few months to be nervous, when it starts to rain again, to run into the parent's bedroom at night, to want to sleep in the same bed as the caregiver, to have some separation anxiety when a caregiver is leaving the house. All of that is normative. When it's going beyond those 2 to 3 months, when it's getting to the point where the child is scared to leave the house, when they are, engaging in risk-taking behaviors, feeling like something bad might happen to me again. When those things are happening, we really want parents to know what are those markers that your child might have PTSD and how can you best refer them.
One of the reasons we're doing this show right now is that we're right in that window for child survivors of Hurricanes Helene and Milton. That window of time when people around them should be sort of looking for signs of emerging PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So, Dr. Kaplow, what are these markers we're looking for?
So markers of PTSD with children include re-experiencing, where they are either having nightmares or literally feeling like the bad event is happening all over again. Like they hear a noise and they think, oh my gosh, that's another shooting. It can also look like avoidance, not wanting to talk about or think about the bad thing that happened. So literally a caregiver starts to talk about the event and they run into another room. That's one example. It can look like numbing, and this gets very confusing for caregivers, where it almost appears as though the child doesn't have any feelings at all. We have caregivers saying, they didn't even cry at the funeral, and I can't understand that. That is often a sign of PTSD, where they have literally shut down their emotions. And then certainly a change in worldview. So literally thinking and talking about the fact that the world is a scary place. I'm always in danger. I don't want to leave the house because I'm terrified. Those kinds of things are things we would be looking for.
And symptoms of PTSD can look different at different ages.
And so in very young children, it can manifest as sort of a clinginess, not wanting the parent to leave the house. It can manifest as behavioral regressions, where they are not advancing in their language or eating or sleeping habits. When we get to school-age kids, it can manifest as social withdrawal, not wanting to interact with other children. It can manifest as attachment issues, where, again, it can be very extreme, where they don't want the caregiver to leave the house, or it can be extreme in the other direction, where they don't want to get close to anybody. In the teenage years, it can certainly manifest as risk-taking behavior. I don't care about my life anymore, so I'm just going to drive recklessly. Or it can actually manifest as suicidal ideation. I just don't want to be here anymore.
Which, of course, is a break glass in case of emergency kind of moment, right? I mean, if a kid is having suicidal ideation, it's time to reach out immediately for an evaluation. You need the professionals to help. One thing that a lot of people don't really know is that trauma can read to people around a child as attention problems.
Yes. And one of the things I will say is that we really try to help teachers in particular with this issue, because oftentimes kids who experience trauma very quickly get labeled as having ADHD when they actually don't have ADHD. So, for example, what we see is that many kids who have ADHD have what's called hyperactivity, right? Hypervigilance, which is what we find in PTSD, can look like hyperactivity. So when someone is hypervigilant, they will jump at the slightest sound, or they will move all over the place because they are remembering the bad thing that happened to them. Similarly, avoidance, which we find in PTSD, can look like distractibility. So they may look like their head is in the clouds, they're not paying any attention at all. The reality is they may be actively trying to avoid thinking about what happened, the bad thing that happened, and that can look like they are distracted.
So what are the risks to a child if trauma is left untreated?
The risks of untreated trauma are many, and they include things like longer-term depression or suicide risk. They include substance abuse. They include relationship problems. They often include school problems. So, long story short, if you experience trauma and do not get the help you need, these are often the ramifications that we're seeing.
And we know that If a child experiences a singular traumatic event on top of a history of traumatic events, the risks to their long-term mental health are greater.
Absolutely, yes. So there is a cumulative effect that happens. And I would say that some of society's most significant problems, including sex trafficking, community violence, mass shootings, stem from unresolved trauma. Now, that doesn't mean that any child who experiences multiple traumas is going to become someone who perpetrates violence. But what that does mean is that when we look at those who have perpetrated violence, more often than not, they have had those cumulative risks.
And those cumulative risks could include a litany of mental health challenges like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. It can also add to the list of what mental health professionals call adverse childhood experiences or events. You may have heard of ACEs, which, as they add up, can be linked to lifelong health conditions like obesity, heart disease, and substance use disorder. ACEs can even change your brain. What can caregivers do to change the trajectory of a child's trauma? We'll talk about that when Petrie Dish continues.
Support for TPR comes from the University of Texas at San Antonio's Brain Health Consortium, a pioneering research hub advancing neuroscience, neuroengineering, precision medicine, and more. Learn more at utsa.edu/BHC.
Welcome back to Petrie Dish. I'm Bonnie Petrie. Shaquita Robinson was 15 years old when Hurricane Katrina hit and intensified the depression she'd already been experiencing. But her mom, Tonette Robinson, is quick to point out that her personality was much bigger than just her mental health challenges.
She was a jolly person, but she was always a hardworking. She was a hustler. She went out and she made her money. She loved working with elderly people.
Shaquita worked for a long time at a nursing home.
And then for Christmas, she would go get funny socks and mittens and hats. And I said, why are you spending your money on these people? She said, Mama, that's my duty. So she was very compassionate when it came to elderly people. And she was compassionate when it came to her children. But it had got to the point where she was dealing with 3 children with autism. Every now and then, I start thinking about it and tears will drop every now and then. But as long as I look at those girls and see her in them, I be like, okay, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right.
Tonette and Shaquita's kids have all now lost someone important to them. And it turns out the death of someone you love dramatically increases your risk of experiencing post-traumatic stress and depressive symptoms long after that first 3 months when everyone is kind of struggling. Kaplow has spent a lot of time studying the intersection of trauma and grief.
You know, trauma and grief actually can have major impacts on children. You know, a child who loses a caregiver may not have post-traumatic stress from that experience, but they may experience what we call separation distress, extreme yearning and longing for the person who died. And in little kids that can be, 2-3 years old, that can literally manifest as waiting by the door for the person to come back, thinking that they are going to come back, or being very confused about what it means to die and not wanting to go to sleep because someone told them, your mom is at rest now. So for young children, it can be very confusing. As we move into the older years, many children will experience what we call existential distress or identity distress, where they feel like, I don't know who I am anymore without this person here. Or I thought I was a lot like my dad, but I don't really remember him very well anymore. So what does that mean about me or my own identity?
After Hurricane Katrina, 70% of the kids who had trauma symptoms had experienced the death of a loved one before the storm. Shaquita Robinson was one of them. Both of her grandmothers died in the years preceding Katrina. Tonette says she loved them very much, and their deaths took a real toll on her. Kaplow says, yes, kids can get stuck in that grief, but it can also lead to growth.
They find healthy ways of feeling connected to the person who died, and that alleviates their separation distress. They can feel like they want to live the legacy of the person who died, where they start to admire the traits and behaviors of their deceased loved one and behave in the same way because they feel like, well, this would have made my dad proud of me, for example. Or with circumstance-related distress, we see this even with young kids where they want to change the circumstances of the death and transform them into something that can be meaningful or helpful to other people. One quick example, I was working with a young boy whose father died in a plane crash, and I asked him, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I want to be an engineer so I can make planes that don't break anymore. And we hear this all the time from kids. I want to be an ER doctor so I can save lives the way I wish they would have saved my brother. Or I want to raise money for breast cancer because mom died of breast cancer. So again, this is not to say that we would ever want something like this to happen to children, but we do know that while there are some negative pathways that they can go down, we also know that there are some adaptive outcomes that can happen even in the midst of tragedy.
You know, it strikes me when we're talking about that 3-ish month window after a disaster where you can do a lot of psychological first aid. It seems like that also might be what you psychologists like to call a critical period, or using strategies to mitigate the potential for a child to sort of slip into PTSD and other long-term mental health challenges. Kaplow says there are 6 things you can do to improve mental health outcomes in the days and weeks after a disaster, and she's put them together conveniently in a way that they all start with the letter S.
And the first is recreating that sense of safety and security. So helping children know that the adults in their lives are there to take care of them. There are things that are kid worries and there are things that are adult worries. And so these are the things that I, as the adult, am going to worry about. How to get our home back together, how to ensure that you are kept safe. Those are things you don't need to worry about. All you need to worry about is doing your homework and figuring out who you're going to play with on the weekend, but really helping kids understand that this is my burden to carry, not your burden to carry. That's the first S.
The second S is straightforward language.
Oftentimes as caregivers, we either provide way too much information and provide lots of details that can be overwhelming to kids, or we don't talk about it at all. And what that does is it sends the message to kids that this is too scary to talk about, or my mom, my dad doesn't think I can handle this. And that sends a message that is not very helpful. So we want to meet kids where they are. One way to do that is to help them guide the conversation and say to them, I know you heard about what happened at that school down the street. I know it's obviously so upsetting for so many of us. What questions do you have for me? Or what worries do you have for me?
And the third, Kaplow says, it's providing supervision, like watching what they watch on TV and not letting them watch some of it.
We know that the media goes crazy after these things happen, and you are seeing over and over and over again the same event happening. For many kids, that can feel overwhelming or like it's happening all over again. So we want parents to be able to monitor that.
Also, structure.
As hard as it is when there's a disaster or something terrible that's happened, to help kids to maintain a regular routine, that helps them to feel like, okay, even though some things have changed around me, there are still things that are under my control that I know are going to happen in the same sequence that they normally happen. I'm going to have breakfast at the same time. I'm going to make the same decisions about, what I do after school as I did before.
All right, S number 5, social support.
Getting kids surrounded by people who love and care about them so that they can feel like they're not alone in what they're going through.
And finally, taking care of yourself. And with an S, That's self-care.
If you are overwhelmed as an adult, kids are like sponges, and they are going to absorb that anxiety in order to be fully present for your child and to make sure that you can take care of them. It's so important to take care of yourself.
All right, Dr. Kaplow. So in the last episode, I was talking with Dr. Deborah Hendrickson about climate change and its impact on kids' health. She said that some teenagers are sort of grappling with this existential dread about a future they may not get to have in their minds. And each disaster sort of underscores that feeling. How do you deal with that?
I think, again, what we want to do is help kids to know what are things I can control and what are things I can't control, and remind them of the things that they do control. So we can walk through the world worried about what could happen. We can also walk through the world knowing, you know what, there are things that I have under my control where I know that I'm going to be okay. And that is often what we end up doing in therapy, is helping kids to change their more unhelpful thought, like, oh no, doom and gloom, the world is a terrifying place, to a more helpful thought. Well, what can I do to change that thought? I can think to myself, you know what? I was okay yesterday. I'm going to be okay today. Or the chances of that happening right now are slim to none. Or I know what I would do in the event of an emergency. Giving them things that they feel like they can, again, have full control over can often empower them so that they are not left feeling completely overwhelmed and helpless.
So they might find purpose in their circumstances. Is that like post-traumatic growth?
Yes. So that is a similar concept, is the idea that after a trauma, people can grow from that traumatic experience. And what we find is that these things can happen all at once. So someone can be really struggling psychologically with the traumatic event that happened and feeling depressed and feeling upset and feeling like they're not sure how they're going to live their life anymore. And at the same time, they can also feel like, you know what, I'm stronger than I thought I was, or I know who my true friends are now, or I know who I can turn to for support. Or like we said earlier, there are things that I want to do with my life now, knowing that life is too short, or that I feel like there is a purpose for me being here.
And that's all part of building resilience, right? Which is, sort of the holy grail in child development circles. How do you equip a child with the tools to bounce back after really bad things happen?
I think the most important thing that parents can do to help kids be resilient is to leave the door of communication open. So that doesn't mean constantly probing and asking questions of your child. How are you feeling? Tell me what you're thinking. But more, I am here whenever you need to talk. And instead of problem solving, which as parents, we always do this, we go in with the mindset of, this is my child, I need to solve their problem, and that means I need to get rid of their distress. Instead of approaching it that way, to simply listen and bear witness to their pain and validate. It is the hardest thing to do as a parent, to just sit there and listen to your child in pain. But what we're finding is that it is probably the most important thing we can do to ensure that they feel like they have a voice, to feel like they feel heard, and then to come back to you when there is something major going on.
But we're both parents here, and parents are scared too. So how do we parent through that? How do we parent our kids to not be traumatized?
Being a parent myself, I completely understand the anxiety and fear of, how am I going to protect my child? How do I help to spare them from experiencing these types of traumas? And the bottom line is that obviously we can't control what goes on in our environment. But what we can control is how we respond to our children and how we can create a sense of safety and security within our own homes, right? And so part of the task for parents is, number one, helping to ensure that they are talking to their kids about what's happening in their environment. One of the most important things parents can do is validate the child's reality, that yes, these things are happening, We're not going to focus exclusively on the bad things that are happening in our environment, but we want to create a space where it's okay to talk about those things so that they know this is a safe place where I can talk about how I'm feeling about it. As parents, though, it's also critically important that we receive our own support. So if you are a parent who is feeling completely overwhelmed, if you are feeling like I can't even get out of bed in the morning, I don't know that I can even show my face at work, I don't know that I can function, that is when we want parents to get their own treatment.
In fact, Kaplow says, research has found that when the parent gets their own treatment for their own PTSD, the child's post-traumatic stress diminishes, even if the child is not in therapy. So put your oxygen mask on first. One more question, Dr. Kaplow. Since it's clear that climate change-driven weather disasters are not going anywhere, shouldn't we have support systems in place already for all kids to sort of get ahead of these serious traumas?
That is a great question. I think that it can never hurt to have programs that are both trauma and grief sensitive. And what I mean by that is recognizing that about 2/3 of U.S. children will experience some form of trauma before they turn the age of 16. And we know that that trend is likely to continue. So recognizing that so many kids will experience a traumatic event and that the most common form of trauma that kids will experience is the death of a loved one. So what we want to do is ensure that the places where we are most likely to encounter these kids have the skills necessary to be able to support them. That is why so much of our work now is in the school system to help teachers recognize signs of trauma and grief, to help schools understand what do I need to do in terms of screening to ensure that if a child does experience a trauma or the death of a loved one, that we can identify them quickly and help them to get the support they need. So those are, just sort of baby steps and first steps toward ensuring that wherever children are, they receive the kind of support that is necessary.
Absolutely. Thank you for your work. And joining us, Dr. Julie Kaplow, Executive Vice President of Trauma and Grief Programs and Policy at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, and the Director of Trauma and Grief Centers in both Houston and in New Orleans. This episode of Petrie Dish was produced by Jacob Rosati, TPR Vice President of News, Dan Katz, and me. I wrote the show, Jacob composed all the music, created the sound design, and edited my script. And Yvette Benavides edited my story on tpr.org. Petrie Dish is a production of Texas Public Radio. I'm Buddy Petrie. Talk to you soon.